The queen forced into incest by her own father, Arsinoe II of Egypt. You're standing in the shadows of a palace corridor in Alexandria, circa 300 BCE, watching a 15-year-old girl prepare for her wedding night. The air smells of myrrh and frankincense, but underneath lies something sharper, fear disguised as perfume. Her hands, adorned with rings too heavy for her fingers, tremble as servants drape her in Egyptian linen dyed with Tyrian purple worth more than most men earn in a lifetime. She is Arsinoe II, daughter of Ptolemy the Soter, and tonight she becomes a commodity in her father's empire-building strategy. The man waiting in the marriage chamber is 55 years old, scarred from decades of warfare, a veteran of Alexander the Great's campaigns. She has met him twice. This is not a love story. This is a transaction written in flesh and sealed with a father's signature. Before we follow Arsinoe through the decades of survival that transform her from victim to goddess, take a moment to subscribe to this channel. I'm constantly amazed that people from Manila to Munich, from Cairo to Chicago, are all here together, connected by our shared fascination with the hidden costs of ancient power. Drop a comment below and let me know where in the world you're watching from. It's incredible how history continues to unite us across continents and centuries. Here's the paradox that makes Arsinoe's story so unsettling. The woman who suffered most from dynastic incest became its greatest architect. She didn't just endure the system, she weaponized it, transformed it, made it into the very foundation of Ptolemaic queenship. By the time she died, sibling marriage had evolved from a desperate political maneuver into a sacred institution that would define Egypt's ruling family for the next 3 centuries. Understanding how that transformation happened requires us to witness something deeply uncomfortable: the alchemy by which trauma becomes tradition and victimhood calcifies into power. Context: the world Arsinoe entered in 316 BCE was one of savage instability. Alexander the Great had died just 7 years earlier, and his empire, stretching from Greece to India, had shattered into competing kingdoms ruled by his former generals, the Diadochi. These men, who had once fought side by side, now turned on each other with the ferocity of wolves fighting over a carcass. Ptolemy, her first Soter, Arsinoe's father, had claimed Egypt as his prize, carrying Alexander's corpse to Alexandria and building his legitimacy on proximity to the god-king's remains. The Ptolemaic court in Alexandria operated according to a brutal calculus. Royal daughters were strategic assets, living treaties sealed in bridal beds. The Greeks had a word for this: katos, the bonds created through marriage alliances. But there was another word they didn't speak aloud: ananke, necessity, the kind that made fathers send teenage daughters to foreign courts, that made mothers coach their children in the arts of political survival, that made every family gathering a negotiation between affection and advantage. Ptolemy I had learned statecraft from the master. Alexander himself had used marriage to bind his empire together, taking wives from Persia, Bactria, Sogdiana, each union a declaration that conquest could transform into integration. But Alexander's marriages had been between conqueror and conquered, Greek and barbarian. What the Diadochi practiced was something more incestuous in spirit, if not always in fact. They married each other's daughters and sisters, creating a closed genetic and political loop that would haunt the Hellenistic world for generations. Egypt, meanwhile, provided a different model entirely. For 3,000 years, Egyptian pharaohs had occasionally married their own siblings, following the template set by the gods themselves. Isis and Osiris, the divine couple who ruled the underworld and guaranteed the Nile's annual flood, were sister and brother, wife and husband. Their union wasn't scandalous. It was cosmically necessary, the sacred marriage that maintained Ma'at, the order that kept chaos at bay. When Ptolemaic rulers looked at temple walls covered in hieroglyphs, they saw a tradition that might solve their legitimacy problem. They were foreign kings ruling an ancient civilization. But what if they could become pharaohs in truth? What if they could adopt not just Egyptian symbols but Egyptian sacred practices? This was the inheritance Arsinoe carried in her blood: Greek ruthlessness and Egyptian mysticism, Macedonian military pragmatism, and the weight of pharaonic tradition. She would need every strand of that inheritance to survive what was coming. The architecture of dynastic marriage. The scale of dynastic intermarriage in the Hellenistic world was staggering. Every major ruling house, Ptolemaic Egypt, Seleucid Syria, Antigonid Macedonia, the kingdoms of Pergamon and Pontus, was connected through a web of marriage alliances so complex that royal genealogies looked like tangled fishing nets. A princess might be married at 15, widowed at 25, remarried to her late husband's rival at 26. Children were born into families where their grandfather might also be their uncle, where their mother's previous husband might be their father's current enemy. Arsinoe's first marriage exemplified this system's cold logic. In 300 BCE, when she was barely 15, Ptolemy thus needed to secure his northeastern frontier against Seleucid expansion. The solution walked on two legs and commanded armies. Lysimachus, king of Thrace, one of Alexander's original bodyguards. He was 55, she was 15. The age gap was 40 years, long enough that he could have been her grandfather. But Lysimachus controlled the approaches to Greece and Macedonia, and that made him valuable. Arsinoe was valuable too, beautiful, educated, the daughter of Egypt's wealthiest kingdom. Together, they represented a partnership of strategic assets. The wedding took place in Sardis, the ancient Persian capital in Asia Minor. Imagine the scene: a vast hall where Greek columns supported Persian architectural flourishes, where incense from Arabia mixed with wine from Thrace, where Egyptian gold gleamed on the bride's wrists while Macedonian nobles offered toasts in honor of her fertility. Arsinoe stood beside Lysimachus wearing ceremonial robes that weighed as much as a suit of armor, her smile fixed like paint on a statue. Around them, hundreds of witnesses celebrated what they chose to interpret as a love match. They could not look away from the spectacle: the blending of dynasties, the promise of heirs, the illusion of romance draped over naked political necessity. But they could not see what Arsinoe saw. She had been trained since childhood to read the currents of power, to understand that her father's affection was real but secondary to his ambitions, that her new husband's courtesy masked calculation. The literary sources, Plutarch, Pausanias, the fragments of Hellenistic historians preserved in later compilations, tell us that Lysimachus was a capable king, a brilliant general, a man of some culture. They do not tell us what it meant for a teenage girl to share a bed with a man who had campaigned with her grandfather's generation, whose body bore scars from battles fought before she was born. Within a year, she was pregnant. She would bear 3 sons in quick succession: Ptolemy, Lysimachus, and Philip, born in 299, 297, and 294 BCE respectively. With each birth, her position strengthened. She was no longer just a foreign bride, but a mother, a potential founder of a dynasty. The court that had watched her with polite curiosity now watched her with calculation. Lysimachus already had an adult son, Agathocles, from his first marriage. The question hanging over the palace like smoke was obvious: who would inherit the kingdom? Court factions formed around the answer. Some nobles supported Agathocles, older, experienced, born of a Greek mother. Others began to see advantage in Arsinoe's sons, backed as they were by Egyptian gold and Ptolemaic military might. The whispers started in corners and corridors, spreading like contagion. The Egyptian queen was ambitious. She was manipulating the aging king. She wanted her sons on the throne even if it meant displacing the legitimate heir. Some of these whispers were propaganda. Some were true. The line between the two blurred until it disappeared. The machinery of elimination. The process by which Agathocles went from heir to corpse took less than a year, but the groundwork was laid over decades. Arsinoe understood something essential about power in the Hellenistic courts. Perception preceded reality. If enough people believed Agathocles was a threat to the kingdom's stability, he would become one, regardless of his actual intentions. If enough nobles could be convinced that he was plotting against his father, the plot would materialize through their very fear of it. The mechanism of his destruction was elegant in its simplicity. First, create distance between father and son. This required patience. Arsinoe never openly criticized Agathocles. That would have been too obvious. Instead, she praised him, but with subtle reservations. "Your son fought well in the campaign," she might say to Lysimachus, though some of the veterans whisper that he takes unnecessary risks. The seed was planted. Agathocles is brave, but reckless. Brave, but perhaps not wise. Second, position her own sons as alternatives. Not as rivals, that too would be too crude, but as complements. She arranged for young Ptolemy, her eldest, to study alongside Agathocles, to train in the same military exercises. Observers noted the Egyptian prince's diligence, his respect for his elders, his careful deference to his father's authority. The contrast was never stated, but always present. Here is steadiness, there is impetuosity. Third, and most crucial, exploit the natural paranoia of an aging king. Lysimachus was 70 by 283 BCE, still mentally sharp but aware of his mortality. Men in his position didn't die peacefully in bed. They were usually murdered by ambitious relatives. Every king of the Diadochi generation had seen rivals eliminated, had perhaps ordered such eliminations themselves. The fear wasn't irrational. It was learned from decades of survival. When the letters were discovered, correspondence allegedly showing that Agathocles was in secret communication with Seleucid agents, Lysimachus was predisposed to believe them. Whether the letters were genuine or forged remains debated by scholars even now. What matters is that they were plausible. Agathocles had reason to seek allies against his stepmother's growing influence. The Seleucids had reason to want an agent in the Thracian court. The logic was airtight even if the evidence was fabricated. The execution was swift. Agathocles was arrested, given a perfunctory trial before a council of nobles who understood which way the wind was blowing, and executed within days. Plutarch preserves a chilling detail. Agathocles was strangled, not beheaded. Strangulation left no honorable scars, no warrior's death. It was the method used for common criminals, a final humiliation. The aftermath split the kingdom. Many of Lysimachus's oldest supporters, men who had campaigned with him for 40 years, were appalled. Agathocles had been popular with the army, respected by the veterans. His death wasn't just a political murder. It was a violation of the unwritten codes that held the military aristocracy together. Soldiers who had followed Lysimachus across Asia now questioned whether their service meant anything, whether loyalty was rewarded or punished. But Arsinoe had achieved her immediate goal. Her sons were now the unchallenged heirs. For exactly 2 years, her gambit seemed to have succeeded. Then Seleucus I, last of Alexander's bodyguards, invaded Thrace, claiming to avenge Agathocles. At the Battle of Corupedium in 281 BCE, Lysimachus's forces shattered. The old king himself died in the fighting, his body lost on the battlefield, later found by enemy soldiers and returned for burial only after days of searching. Arsinoe, now 45, found herself a widow with 3 sons and no kingdom. The court she had dominated for 2 decades dissolved overnight. Seleucus's army was approaching the capital. Her husband's remaining supporters blamed her for the catastrophe. If she hadn't engineered Agathocles' death, the kingdom might have held together. Her sons, aged 17, 15, and 12, were now targets. In the brutal arithmetic of Hellenistic succession, they were loose ends to be eliminated. The trap, springs shut. She fled with her sons toward the coast, carrying what gold she could, abandoning 2 decades of accumulated power in a single desperate night. The journey was a nightmare of near captures and narrow escapes. Sleeping in wine shops and fishermen's huts, the Queen of Thrace reduced to traveling in servants' clothes. Behind her, Seleucus's forces methodically hunted down Lysimachus's family. Several of her husband's relatives were captured and executed. The message was clear: the old order was being erased. They made it to Samothrace, a sacred island where ancient mystery cults offered sanctuary even kings were supposed to respect. There, in the precinct of the great gods, Arsinoe caught her breath and calculated her options. She had supporters still, nobles who had fled with her, merchants with Egyptian connections, priests who remembered that she was a Ptolemy. But she had no army, no secure base, no husband to give her sons legitimacy. Then came the message from Macedonia. Her half-brother Ptolemy Ceraunus, Thunderbolt, had murdered Seleucus and seized the Macedonian throne. He was offering marriage. The proposal came wrapped in honeyed words: family reconciliation, protection for her sons, a return to queenship. He promised to name her boys as heirs to Macedonia, to give them the kingdom their father had lost. Arsinoe was 45 years old, and she had survived 3 decades in the most dangerous courts of the Hellenistic world. She knew what men's promises were worth. She knew that Chironus was called Thunderbolt, not for swiftness, but for sudden, destructive violence. She knew he had murdered an old man who had sheltered him, had seized a throne through treachery. Every instinct screamed that this was a trap. With nowhere else to turn, Arsinoe chose what seemed the least fatal trap: marriage to her half-brother, Ptolemy Ceraunus. She sent her eldest son away for safety, then sailed to Macedonia with her 2 younger boys, Lysimachus and Philip. The wedding glittered with royal spectacle, masking a fatal deceit. Within weeks, Chironus ordered her sons murdered, erasing rivals and shattering the last of her defenses. In the wake of unimaginable loss, Arsinoe refused to die with her grief. She escaped. How? No one knows, slipping out of Pella under cover of chaos and returning to Samothrace before pleading for refuge in Egypt. At 50, twice widowed and childless, she had been queen, exile, and survivor. Now she sought not safety but purpose, determined to turn catastrophe into the foundation of her final transformation. The transformation. When Arsinoe returned to Egypt, grief had carved her into steel. Her brother, Ptolemy II, saw in her both a survivor and an asset, someone who understood power not as ceremony but as endurance. Their marriage in 273 BCE, shocking to the Greek world but sacred in Egyptian tradition, transformed scandal into strategy. Together they became the sibling gods, merging politics with divinity and creating a legitimacy no rival could match. As queen, Arsinoe ruled with fierce purpose. She co-led campaigns, reformed the royal cult, and established temples honoring their divine union. Through intellect and will, she redefined queenship itself, no longer a symbol beside the throne, but its equal. In turning exploitation into authority, Arsinoe II forged a model of female power that would echo through every Ptolemaic queen who followed. The calcified legacy, short version, Arsinoe II, died in 270 BCE, leaving behind not just a dynasty, but a doctrine. Ptolemy II mourned deeply, deifying her as Arsinoe Philadelphus, the first living queen to be worshipped as a goddess. Her cult spread across Egypt, her image stamped on coins and sanctified in temples. What began as devotion soon hardened into precedent. Generation after generation of Ptolemies married their own blood, transforming one woman's survival strategy into dynastic law. In time, that legacy calcified. Power preserved at the cost of lineage and sanity. The royal line narrowed to near collapse, yet Arsinoe's name endured in prayers like one found on a papyrus in Cairo, where a mother begged her aid for a daughter trapped in an unwanted marriage. To that woman, Arsinoe wasn't a symbol of royal corruption but of endurance, proof that even within the machinery of power, a woman could rewrite her fate and leave a mark history couldn't erase. The Price of Transcendence, short version. Among the ruins of Alexandria, Arsinoe's story lingers, a woman who traded love, children, and peace for power and divinity. Forced into political marriages, she turned exploitation into agency, breaking Greek taboos to redefine queenship itself. The system tried to erase her, but she made herself unforgettable. A goddess, not a pawn. A coin in Cairo bears her face, regal beneath Egypt's double crown, the first living queen shown as divine. Her transformation cost her everything human, yet secured her immortality. Arsinoe turned the very weapon used against her into a crown, proving that sometimes survival means mastering the machinery of power until you become indistinguishable from it.